Hope everybody's feeling good after lunch. My name is Ben Pridonoff. I am a graduate student fellow with the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt, and I'm really honored to be here today to speak with you about entanglement and floating offshore wind energy. This will be a high-level what do we know kind of conversation, first starting out with how entanglement occurs at floating offshore wind farms, and then moving on to the Moorsea project, which is a Schatz Center project, a potential monitoring solution to the problem of entanglement at offshore wind farms. Moorsea standing for mooring sensors for environmental awareness. But before we dig into that, other speakers kind of primed us for this, so I'll move through this quickly, but why are we talking about floating offshore wind farms? Many of us are familiar with fixed bottom conventional offshore wind that's common in the North Sea of Europe, as well as becoming increasingly common off of the East Coast. But those systems are a lot shallower, and our West Coast bathymetry is very different. We are dealing with water depths close to 300 to 1,000 meters depth, making floating turbines the necessity. They are still anchored to the seafloor using cables known as mooring lines. Here you see a different representation of these mooring lines. Typically, designs show 3 mooring lines per turbine. You also see an inter-array cable, or this cable connecting the turbines. This allows electricity to be transmitted between the turbines. So between the inter-array cables and the mooring lines, there's obviously a lot of new underwater infrastructure introduced to this ocean system. All of this underwater infrastructure has the potential to aggregate any marine debris that's floating through the area. One other thing I want to point out about this figure too is the humpback whale for relative scale. While there is a lot of new stuff in these waters, the spacing and scale of the turbine suggests that there's hopefully space for these large creatures to navigate, especially as you go further down into the water column. So this brings us to the key problem of the talk, which is that floating debris that becomes caught on offshore wind mooring lines and inter-array cables may create an entanglement hazard for marine life. As you see with the figure on the right, crab pots, derelict fishing gear, which I might sometimes refer to as ghost nets, any sort of large marine debris might wrap itself around a mooring line and remain in place, posing an entanglement risk for marine life. Now, there are 2 different main types of entanglements that can occur at floating offshore wind facilities. Primary entanglement, which is marine life becoming directly entangled with a mooring line or inter-array cable. And secondary entanglement, which I kind of briefly touched on, which is marine life becoming entangled with marine debris that's snagged on a mooring line or inter-array cable. Another version of secondary entanglement, sometimes called tertiary entanglement, but we're going to group them together for this talk, is if an animal is already entangled and dragging a net or line behind it and moves through the area, and that net gets snagged on a mooring line, fixing the animal in the mooring line system. The risk of primary entanglement, according to the literature, is very low, especially with mooring lines. This is because the cables are rather wide, think a few inches to a foot in diameter, and are engineered to be sturdy so they don't loop or bend, making it difficult for them to wrap around an animal, let alone a smaller animal that's able to easily navigate through the area. Secondary entanglement, though, is the leading cause of concern. The impacts are still unclear because we obviously don't have any large-scale commercial floating offshore wind facilities to look to for lessons learned, but lessons learned from entanglements related to industrial fishing suggest that large migratory whales are at greatest risk. Here are just some examples of species that have the potential to occur within the Humboldt Bay wind energy area. We have California sea lion, leatherback sea turtle, humpback whale, and mako shark, all experiencing different entanglements here. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves of both the physiological and population level effects that entanglement can have, especially because for many of these species, entanglement can be the leading risk to their population viability. Some of these impacts include reduced foraging ability, tissue damage, potentially leading to muscle or nerve damage, infection, and death, reduced mobility, affecting migration, foraging, and reproduction, potential effects on populations, that is the larger group of that animal within an area, if mortality or reduced breeding become too great, and then specifically in the case of underwater infrastructure like offshore wind, drowning if an animal is unable to break free of a mooring line entanglement and can't reach the sea surface for air. Here are just 7 example at-risk species that our team investigated first. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but hopefully primes you to the different types of animals that could be entangled and affected and have the potential to occur within these wind energy areas. Now we've covered the wildlife side a bit. We should talk also about the physical entanglements themselves. Entanglement data from the National Marine Fisheries Service, as well as interviews with members of the commercial fishing community, suggest that lost fishing gear most likely to contribute to a secondary entanglement include some of the following. Crab pots. Many of us might know that crab pots are amongst the most common types of entanglements within the California current system. They can also form what are called flower gardens or rosebuds. These are aggregations of crab pot lines when, for instance, a storm comes through, moves them from their intended place, and they kind of tangle up within each other and tumbleweed beneath the sea surface, eventually colliding perhaps with the mooring line system. Other types of entanglements of concern include long line entanglements and drag nets. We also should touch briefly on biofouling. And you all already got a great primer on biofouling earlier, but as a reminder, it is the kind of accumulation of marine invertebrates on hard surfaces within the ocean. So think anemones, barnacles, mussels. Biofouling has the potential to affect this in many ways. It affects the roughness of these infrastructures, potentially making it easier for marine debris to snag on it. And it also might attract other species that depend on those biofouling creatures, exposing them to the entanglement risk. But our efforts to source fishing gear data or data on other marine debris is absolutely ongoing. So now that we've kind of discussed a high-level overview of the problem, let's discuss a potential monitoring solution, which is this mooring sensors for environmental awareness project that the Schatz Center is conducting along with a number of project partners. At its core, this project develops a network of sensors that run along the length of each of the mooring lines that can detect both entanglements without an animal as well as any sort of animal entanglement. So put simply, the Moorsea project seeks to develop an integrated system capable of remotely monitoring mooring lines for entanglement hazards, identifying entanglements, and deploying a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, to visually inspect them. So how this might go in the real world is a ghost net or a whale entanglement gets caught on the mooring line. The sensor detects that disturbance, notifies a human ROV operator to inspect it. Future iterations of this project or applications of the Moorsea system might see the potential removal of a ghost net. However, it's really important to note that removal of any net without an animal entangled is far, far more feasible than disentanglement efforts that involve animals that are already entangled. As Professor Gullier could tell you, there are regulatory burdens, risk to human health, and of course, risk to the animals involved in those types of disentanglement efforts. The detection algorithm that's baked into this whole sensor system, like I said, is designed to identify both lone ghost nets and animal entanglements and collisions. The sensor system may also be able to identify the species entangled based off of the force levels registered. So let's say the sensor system picks up a ping of 50 kilonewtons of force. There might only be a certain species or a certain number of species capable of producing that amount of force. So immediately just from that sensing, we might know something about the animal entangled. This is, of course, really important both for scientific purposes, because this is a nascent field of study, and also for regulatory purposes, because oftentimes infrastructure projects like these are required to report how many of each species, specifically endangered species, they're harming. So to do this sort of species identification, we need to know how much force each species can produce. I won't go too much into the details of our methods here because it could be its own 15-minute talk, and I'm happy to talk with folks after more about it. But put very simply, we first measure whale vertebra to estimate an individual whale's force output. So here you see me with a gray whale vertebra. You can take those measurements, run it through a number of calculations, and end up with a minimum and maximum force for that specific whale. But let's say that gray whale is on the smaller side. We want to make sure that we are conservatively capturing everything from the smallest free-swimming gray whale calf to the largest adult. Thankfully, there's this relationship that we can kind of depend upon. where as cetaceans get longer, they reliably produce more force. So we can, put simply, combine these two things, both our knowledge of the specimen's force output and our knowledge of the species' total lengths, to arrive at a minimum and maximum length for that species. And we've been successful in generating these estimates. These are just the 7 initial species that I mentioned, but we have estimates for most of the whales, dolphins, and porpoises expected to occur within the Humboldt and Morro Bay wind energy areas. Notably, of course, our pinnipeds and sea turtle friends are not yet calculated. Their body morphology is very different, but those efforts are absolutely ongoing. So just kind of to reiterate, this means that we might be able to say something about any animal that's entangled simply based off of like a sensor detection. Now the Morse system is one tool within an ever-diversifying toolkit. We talked about ghost net removals briefly earlier. I also want to mention marine debris recovery programs, which are oftentimes collaborations between entities like NOAA and the commercial fishing community to collect lost fishing gear, kind of attacking the problem at its source. All sorts of other surveys, both like established methods of monitoring could be discussed. I don't think I have time to go into all of this, but it's needless to say, further research is definitely needed, but there's also a lot of fantastic efforts and a lot of really smart people that are working on this problem. I want to end with this graph here from one of the papers we reviewed. I know it's a little bit complicated, but basically at the kind of top end, you have your larger whales like blue whales that produce a lot of force. And as you get smaller, you have smaller creatures like dolphins that produce less force. The horizontal colored lines show the breakage strength of some common commercial fishing gear. And so you can see that any species underneath those lines are unable to break free of that given entanglement. And even the larger species might only be able to break free under the ideal conditions. And I think this really just drives home the important point to me that, one, we need to detect these entanglements as soon as possible. And 2, remove them in kind of that critical period before an animal gets entangled. Otherwise, it becomes significantly more difficult. And obviously, we want to prevent those physiological effects and populational level effects that we discussed earlier from coming to bear. So with that, I want to thank the fantastic project partners and team that I get to be a part of. I hope you all learned something. Thanks so much.